The summer Emmett Voss turned 11, he started hauling boxes other beekeepers wanted burned. Every Sunday after church, he'd load his father's truck bed with a handcart and drive the back roads of Tabor County, New York. Stopping at the edges of orchards where stacked wooden hive boxes sat abandoned near the tree line. He wasn't looking for firewood. He wasn't building a fort. He had a single quiet purpose, and he wasn't telling anyone what it was. He knocked on doors. He asked politely, and beekeeper after beekeeper said the same thing. "Take 'em. Just don't bring the mites back here." Then they'd lean against their truck doors and watch him load boxes crawling with dying, dwindling colonies, and they'd shake their heads, the tired, resigned kind of headshake that comes not from cruelty, but from watching too many hives die to feel much of anything about one more. An 11-year-old boy hauling away colonies everyone else had already given up on. By July, he had more failing hives than some of the commercial outfits 2 counties over, and he hadn't explained himself to a single soul. Nobody knew what he was planning, not even his father. But they were about to find out. If stories of determination, family, and the quiet wisdom hidden in ordinary places move you, subscribe, and join us every week. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this story has traveled. Tabor County sits in the fruit belt along the southern shore of Lake Ontario, where the lake effect keeps frost off the blossoms just long enough most years. By late April, the hills turn white and pink with apple bloom for about 10 days, the only window that matters for the whole season's harvest. It was the kind of place where families had grown apples for 4 generations and measured their year by a single week of flowering. Emmett Voss was the youngest of 3, born to Dallas and Rhea Voss, who worked 60 acres of Empire and Honeycrisp on the ridge above the lake. Dallas was a careful man, slow to worry, except during bloom week, which tested him the way nothing else did. Rhea kept the farm's books and had started quietly, keeping a second set of numbers nobody liked to look at, what the orchard spent on rented pollination each spring. Emmett's grandmother, Odessa, lived in the converted sunroom off the kitchen. She was 79 and spent most mornings with black coffee and a stack of handwritten beekeeping journals that had belonged to her late husband. She read them the way other people read letters from someone they missed. It was Odessa who first noticed that Emmett wasn't just curious about bees the way other kids were. He was watching which hives survived and which didn't, and asking why. The spring Tabor County entered its 4th year of a regional pollinator shortage. Emmett began to see a problem the adults around him had simply learned to budget for. His father's bloom week that year needed roughly 40 strong hives across the ridge to pollinate properly. The commercial pollination outfit the Vosses had used for a decade quoted them $6,400 for the season, nearly double what it had cost 5 years earlier, and could only guarantee 24 hives, not 40, because their own colonies were dying over winter faster than they could replace them. The county apiary inspector, a measured man named Wilmer Doss, had come out twice to look at the surrounding die-offs and offered what explanation he could. Varroa mites, viral load, colonies collapsing every winter faster than beekeepers could rebuild them. "Best thing you can do," Wilmer told Dallas, "is find hives with genetics that actually fight the mites off instead of just spraying and hoping." Emmett listened to every word Wilmer Doss said. He asked a question Wilmer wasn't used to hearing from 11-year-olds. If the strong hives are the ones that fight mites off on their own, what happens to the weak ones people are throwing away? Do any of them have that in them too, just not enough of it yet? Wilmer paused. Some. Hard to tell which, though. Most people don't bother finding out. Emmett nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they've already thought about something for a long time, and just needed one more piece to confirm it. That was in April. By May, he had started collecting dying hives. Here is what Emmett understood, and what most of the adults around him had never quite put together. A colony doesn't fail all at once. It fails unevenly. Some bees in a dying hive carry a trait called hygienic behavior, meaning they detect and remove mite-infested brood before the mites can reproduce. In a strong colony, that trait spreads. In a weak, crashing colony, it's often still there, just buried under a queen who's failing and a population too small to express it. Odessa's late husband's journals had a whole section on it, written in the 1970s before anyone called it hygienic behavior. He just called it the hives that clean house. Emmett's idea was simple, and almost nobody does it on purpose. Instead of combining or requeening a dying hive with fresh-bought bees, take the few surviving bees from several condemned colonies, test which ones showed the cleaning behavior, and build new starter colonies, walk-away splits, using only the survivors that had already proven they could fight. It's slower than buying a package of bees from a supplier. It's also nearly free. And if it worked, the resulting colonies would be built from genetics that had already survived one collapse. He had the dying hives. What he needed now was a way to actually test and split them without losing what was left. What he built that spring was not elegant. It was a child's version of a breeding program. Mismatched deep boxes salvaged from 6 different abandoned yards, a second-hand smoker held together with hose clamps, and a magnifying loupe he'd bought with money saved from mowing lawns to count mites on a sticky board. He inspected every rescued hive by hand, marking which ones showed bees pulling out infested brood, the cleaning behavior Odessa's husband had written about. His father watched from a distance the first 2 weekends, said nothing, and then quietly went and got his own bee suit and helped, without asking what exactly they were building. That was Dallas's way. His older brother Roy thought the whole thing was a waste of a summer he could have spent on the tractor. His younger sister Fen thought it looked like a science fair project and stayed close, holding frames she wasn't tall enough to lift on her own. The first attempt failed. Emmett combined survivors from 3 collapsing hives into 2 new splits in early May. Too early. There weren't enough nurse bees left to keep the brood warm overnight, and a cold snap killed both attempts within a week. He went back to the journals. He found a passage about split timing, how a colony needs a minimum working population before it can regulate its own temperature, regardless of how promising its genetics are. He'd rushed it. He tried again in late May with 4 source hives instead of 3, giving each split more bees to start with. This time, the splits survived the first week, but the new queens they raised didn't mate well, and 2 of the 4 colonies went queenless by mid-June, which meant they'd fail within a month without intervention. He spent 2 weeks trading nukes and open questions with a retired commercial beekeeper named Selby Kranz, who had run 400 hives before mite pressure, and rising costs pushed him into retirement in 2011. Selby taught him how to spot a properly mated queen versus a failing one, and gave him 3 mated queens from his own remaining hives, free, because he said he liked Emmett's stubbornness. On the 3rd attempt, the system worked. By mid-July, 4 of Emmett's rebuilt colonies were the strongest hives on the ridge, heavier with capped brood, calmer on inspection, bringing in more pollen than colonies his father had rented that same spring. Dallas noticed first. He walked the row of hive stands twice before saying anything. The rescued colonies had almost no visible mite damage. The rented commercial hives nearby were already showing the ragged, patchy brood pattern of colonies under stress. He went to find his son. Emmett was crouched at a hive entrance, watching bees fan at the landing board. "How many of these are actually going to make it through winter?" Dallas asked. Emmett told him, probably all 4, based on what Selby in the journal said about hygienic line colonies. Dallas was quiet for a long time. Then, "You want to try for 12 next year?" Wilmer Doss came back in August, officially this time. He walked every hive with Emmett, asking questions and taking notes. He had the posture of a man recalibrating something. He said he'd never seen a hobbyist rebuild mite-resistant colonies from condemned equipment with this kind of consistency, let alone an 11-year-old. He asked if he could bring an apiculture researcher from Cornell out the following spring. A reporter from the county paper came too. Eventually, she wrote a feature that ran on the front page below the fold. The headline called Emmett a bee whisperer. Emmett thought the nickname was ridiculous. He wasn't whispering to anything. He was just testing which bees already knew how to fight. By September, word had traveled. The beekeepers who had handed Emmett their dying hives, the ones who had shaken their heads and told him not to bring the mites back, drove out to see for themselves. They came expecting to be polite. They were not prepared for what they found. Emmett's hive row was the healthiest in the county. While neighboring colonies were already showing the thin, patchy populations of hives heading into a rough winter, his rebuilt colonies were dense with bees, calm on approach, heavy with stored honey for the season ahead. A few of the beekeepers walked the row without saying much. One of them lifted a frame and held it up to the light for a long moment, then looked at the boy standing beside the hive stand with propolis on his gloves. "What did you do different?" He showed them. The testing, the splits, the patience to let bees that already knew how to fight pass that on to the next generation, instead of buying new bees every spring and hoping the mites wouldn't come back the way they always had. He walked them through every box, every marked frame, every colony that had once been headed for the burn pile. The head shaking was gone. In its place was something quieter, something that takes longer to arrive than a shrug, but lasts considerably longer. Several of them asked Emmett if he'd help them test their own remaining hives before winter. He said he would. There's an old saying among beekeepers, passed down more than it's ever been written: take care of the bees, and the bees will take care of the harvest. Emmett Voss rebuilt 4 hives that summer. Strong hives, mite-resistant, self-sustaining hives that outperformed colonies managed by professionals with decades of experience. But that wasn't the harvest. The harvest was something harder to measure. The patience of a child who watched survival instead of yield. The willingness to take what everyone else had already condemned. The discipline to fail twice and rebuild without complaint. Real beekeeping knowledge rarely comes from buying more bees. It comes from paying attention, from understanding that a dying colony still carries something worth saving if you're willing to figure out what it is. Emmett is 12 now. He's already planning to rebuild 12 colonies next spring. Selby Krantz is helping him with the queen genetics. Odessa is still reading the journals. And the hive boxes that once sat rotting at the edge of orchards across Tabor County are humming again. What beekeeping, or just patience, lessons stayed with you from Emmett's story? Drop it in the comments. We read everyone. Tell us where you're watching from. This community reaches further than you'd think. And if stories like this one matter to you, subscribe.